the Christian church. And last week we were trying to understand like where we're coming from. We were trying to understand like what's going on in the nation and just interpreting the crisis. And we had Felix Sumba and the musician Ruben Kigame, and they're trying to help us understand, how did we get into this crisis that we're in as a country. And now today we have a very able team that's going to help us understand the crisis that we tried to interpret last week. And so we have Dr. Eric KINAGO, and so like I would just say a few things about Dr. Eric KINAGO. He's a governance practitioner, and having worked in the civil society space in various capacities, including as a national coordinator for the Shule Yangu Alliance campaign, which helped in institutionalizing protection efforts by civil society actors against public school land grabbing in Kenya. He has worked in the anti-corruption, fiscal justice, education, health, and land sectors, among others. Eric holds a bachelor's degree in political science and public administration and is finalizing his master's degree in development studies. Above all, he is born again, working hard to support the realization of God's will on earth as it is in heaven. And we are grateful to have him today. And also alongside him, we have Dr. Abraham RUGO Morio, commonly Dr. Arms, and he's passionate and committed to advancing local development. He has a wealth of experience working in decentralization, participatory governance, and public finance management in Kenya. His work over the last 19 years has entailed supporting citizens to participate in and advocate for improved service delivery by government at national and local level. This has been through research, policy analysis, and advocacy, facilitating capacity building programs and engaging in public debate and educational talks. He's currently the Executive Director, Bajeti Hub, formerly IBP Kenya, based in Nairobi since July 2017. And he previously worked at the Institute of Economic Affairs from 2007 to 2013, and as a public policy and devolution consultant 2014 to 2017. And again, I'm glad that you're joining us here today. And so as just want to confirm something from my technical team before we continue. Just told that there might be a technical issue somewhere that I want to confirm. Just a second. So just hold on there until I confirm something. All right, I think we are good. So like, yeah, so with the introduction now, so maybe we can start with Dr. RUGO. And so last week we were talking more about how we have this movement of young people who are trying to call the government to account. And so like we're trying to understand like how it happened when we're not used to having young people getting involved in politics. And so at the moment, like maybe if you could be able like to maybe help us understand like what you think the Halabaloo is also about as we just try to progress from what we discussed last week. And like whether as Christians we should care about, finance bills or whatever other bills there are that we don't know about, and how we can meaningfully engage in politics. So maybe you can explain how you understand the finance bill, because it seems to be the genesis of what has become something else. The revenue and appropriation bill, the budget, and any other major bills directly affecting us at the moment. So maybe we can start from there, Dr. RUGO.
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I want to really appreciate Apologetics Kenya for organizing this. I hold it very strongly that we who have made, the decision to be the disciples of Christ have a responsibility in our society to contribute. And the scriptures will remind us very clearly that, God desires that his kingdom, and his will be done here on earth. So what I believe God's will is that his people, whether they know him or they don't know him, enjoy the good that the land has to offer. And they don't have to enjoy it because they are privileged, because they are rich, because they are who is who. They just need to enjoy it because they are humans, and created in the image of God. And therefore, for me, it's really a privilege. Part of the big driver for me is just that appreciation that God has created all of us equal, and that we all have a responsibility, to contribute and to make. To start us off is that at the crux of what we are going through right now is an old tension, I would say, of how a society distributes its resources for the good of all. And the tension is that for some, who believe that we are supposed to amass this and then distribute it to others as we see. But for others, it's as we are supposed to be making it all together. There's a common joke about, welfare, about those who get well and those who pay the fare. So it's a resource tussle. It's a resource tussle. When you think about what drove a lot of the constitution reforms in this country, for which the church was largely involved in, it was a resource question. It's about how do we distribute social resources, how do we distribute political resources, which has to do with power and ability to control that power. How do we distribute financial resources? How do we redistribute natural resources, human capital? You had places in this country where there was no, in the entire vicinity, there is no neurologist or there is no pediatrician who has been trained, but you have another place where they basically count PhDs per square kilometer. So it was at the center of it was all that, and therefore it was a finance, it was a resource question. And therefore, if we think about the matters that we are dealing with right now, is that right at the center there, we established a very elaborate budget process making, which basically has got three components, if I may. The first component is that there is an expenditure component. There are the things we have decided we want to spend money on. And these are the things that these are the aspirations. These are the, objectives, the targets, the things we want to achieve. Where are they found? They are found in the Bill of Rights. So anytime you struggle about what informs what we should be spending our money on, it is the Bill of Rights. And where does the Bill of Rights come from? The Bill of Rights draws all its strength and power from Article 1 of the Constitution, that the sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya, and they are the ones to choose how they wish to exercise that power, whether directly or indirectly. And therefore, then as you come to the other, everything else that follows the Bill of Rights is basically a mechanism of how we shall achieve the Bill of Rights. Chapter 6, that we shall do it with, by offering leadership with integrity. You go to the to the various chapters. The chapter on executive, how we shall distribute executive power. The chapter on judiciary, how we shall distribute judicial power. The chapter on legislature, how we shall, how we shall put checks and balances. The chapter on devolution, chapter 11, how we shall distribute power between a national government and county governments. Chapter 12, the public finance management chapter, how we shall distribute public finances to achieve the aspirations that we have set for ourselves. So the expenditure question. If you ask me, the expenditure question, or what is finally passed as the appropriation bill, is where we must spend much more attention. And today, this morning, we had a public forum where we were discussing about expenditure. The second component of that discussion is the revenues. This is the income. So if you think about expenditure as where we will spend the money, the items we'll spend the money on, the revenue side, basically the finance side, is basically the revenue. Where shall we get the money from? And that is what is contained by different laws that guide how we collect our taxes, that guide how we how we deal, with the different fees and rates. And that is what the finance bill we've been dealing, people have been very charged about. That's where it comes. But the finance bill comes to provide mechanisms and measures of, one, how to raise additional resources, of two, how to improve and better, create an environment of, that supports business and the like, and three, how to improve tax administration. So for instance, you see a lot of the changes that the finance bill will come up with. It either is raising rates, so it's reducing some rates, it's giving some reliefs, it's removing some reliefs. The idea is to create an environment where the government can be able either to collect the same amount of resources, to collect the resources more cheaply, with less administration, less cost, and what have you. And therefore, a discussion on finance bill is incomplete without a discussion on appropriations bill, because you cannot discuss revenue as an end in itself. Revenue is enabling you achieve something. But there's a middle section, which is to make it my last point for now, is that how do we deal with the gap between our revenue and our expenditure, which is what we call deficit financing. Where do we get the money to deal with that? So for instance, if you think about it, you have a budget of, say, 300 shillings, which is basically, 3,000. Let me use 3,000. 3,000, but anytime I say 1,000, just read trillion. So you have a budget of about 3,000. But the only income you are likely to have is 2,500. You have to figure out where you get the 500. And there are only two options of how you deal with this gap. One, you either reduce your spending by 500, or you find alternative ways of raising the 500, which means borrowing, borrowing of different forms, or finding other mechanisms of increasing your revenue. So for instance, you take a second job. Some people will take a second job or a third job. Some people will take a soft loan, others, depending. But now there's a lot of discussion on the revenue side of the finance bill, what the finance bill helps to raise more of. Remember, even if there is no finance bill, the country does not come to a halt. Why? Because the finance bill that was rejected was going to raise 346 billion out of a budget of 3.99 trillion. So basically, it was going to raise just about 10%. Meaning the laws that are already in existence, the Income Tax Act that is already in place, the VAT measures that are already in place, the Levies and Miscellaneous Act that is already in place, all those who are still going to raise for you some 3 trillion shillings, as it were. So I think that, Charles, just for a start, those are the things that I think are important for the budget. But important is that there is no much conversation about expenditure, and there is even much less conversation about this deficit financing, which is what has led, if you ask me, we are in the hole we are in today because of how we have dealt with deficit financing. Because the deficits have been growing over time, and we are borrowing more and more and more and more and more, even when our revenues don't perform. I stop there. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, thanks for the definitions there. And for some of us who are not very economically astute, I think we have learned a bit. And I guess maybe Eric can comment as, I guess, like, even as we think about the expenditure, the discussion that people are not having, as it, whether like not considering what the expenditure is of the nation and how much it's affecting us being able to meet our finances and our demands. If you could be able to speak about whether you feel like, is that the reason why there's been a lot of tension in the country? Like you feel like Kenyans actually understand that the expenditure has gone beyond what it's supposed to be? And is that like why Kenyans are angry and whether it's justified? And also, if we consider the fact that the finance bill would still raise that 10% that we've had, would that have probably made Kenyans less angry if they realized that it would help a bit? Maybe you can comment on that, Eric, as as you also maybe expound on what Dr. RUGO has said.
All right. Thanks, Charles. And it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation this evening. I must say that it is not easy to speak after Dr. RUGO, because if you want me to speak in this conversation, you have to allow me to speak before Dr. RUGO comes so that he summarizes. But nonetheless, I think he's given a very elaborate genesis as to why and how we've gotten where we are as a country. It's not by accident, and it's been a result of very systematic issues across our history as a country. And maybe one of the limbs that I'd like to speak about that has been part of our history that has gotten us here is, I think, part of our history. A lot of the things that Dr. RUGO mentioned happened in the current constitutional order that we have in 2010. We didn't always, as a country, have a progressive constitution like we do, that was promulgated in August 2010. And this was not always who we were as a country. And I think what we've had and what we've seen in this country since 2010 is that we have a very progressive constitutional framework, which has been lauded by many as perhaps being one of the best in the world. I'm not sure. I think that is almost becoming it's almost becoming a popular statement. But I think a lot has not been said and focused around a political culture that has been attendant in our country. So we have a progressive culture that progressive constitutional framework that is not in tandem with our political culture. And the political culture in this country is to the extent that you have political leaders or duty bearers in various positions of leadership and service or power, as the case may be, who deep down in their hearts do not believe that they're accountable to the people who RUGO mentions in Article 1 of our Constitution, who have a sovereign power. So, and I think these are some of the pent-up issues that we've carried along. So, to the extent that it wasn't just in 2010 when we passed a new constitution, it wasn't just about the constitution, but about a culture that we needed to fix. And when you look at the various chapters of our constitution, there's an implicit attempt, very deliberately so, to try and claw back what you always had prior to 2010, which is an imperial presidency. Have a centralist system where the president, and this began way before independence, where we had parts of this country that were declared as productive, others non-productive, and then you have the post-independence leadership coming in, and in a sense, successive regimes adopting that sort of thing, where you have the president deciding almost by discretion what parts of Kenya are going to receive development, what parts of Kenya won't. And as a result of that, you've seen a great sense of inequality across the various corners of our country, and largely driven very systematically by successive regimes that we've had. And I think these are some of the issues, and I think it explains why we've had Kenyans be preoccupied about the habits that we've seen, the opulence that we've seen, the primitive showcasing of wealth by people who are in government, and I think it has carried, or it has ridden along the wave about our expenditure, that because of our financial indiscipline in the last 10 years, we made certain decisions as a country that had consequences, and part of what we are reeling now is the consequences of those decisions of those previous years, including the last 2 years of this current regime. But it's also about, while we've spoken about the need to reorganize our lives, our public spending, in view of the consequences that we are now feeling, it's also efforts within government that have not been in tandem with what they are asking citizens to do. So, you've had the president talk about measures that need to be taken to ensure that our debt situation does not become unsustainable, because the more our debt rises as a country, the less fiscal space we have to be able to do other important things, to be able to provide for the essential public goods, or promote the Bill of Rights, as the case may be, provision of education, provision of healthcare. The less fiscal space you have, and this is the situation we find ourselves in the country, to be able to implement and provide those goods, the harder it becomes to be able to manage. And I think that's part of the sentiment we are having. So I think there's something to be said about the culture of a culture of political impunity in this country, where you have people in government, those who have been entrusted with the sovereign power, because in Article 1 of our Constitution, it says that sovereign power lies within the people of the Republic of Kenya, and they can exercise this directly or indirectly. And indirectly is through the representatives that they were elected or appointed. And so when you have people that you've elected or appointed who seem to operate outside the framework of expectation that the rest of the Republic has, then you have a problem. And maybe that explains why last year's finance bill was, yes, contentious, and probably we did not see the level of the extent to which this year's finance bill got. And why is that the case? It's because Kenyans were against the finance bill last year because of what it was seeking to do, but they did not feel heard. And so if you don't feel heard, and you have another year coming, and a level of obstinacy and carelessness within the political elite to try and push through hook and crook some of these very punitive tax measures, then you have the resultant effect of what we are seeing in the country. And I think I just thought I could bring in that bit around the political accountability, or rather the lack of political accountability, and a culture of impunity, really, because it's a culture of impunity where you disregard the people who elected you and the electorate, and insist that you must do what you think is important or is critical, regardless of what the people that you are working for think.
Right. Oh yeah, thanks, Eric, for that. In fact, I've been able to catch. You said Article 1 is the one that endows the population with those, I guess, the rights to be able to call politicians into account. I've just remembered a meme that was running about how people may or shall have the rights. I don't know if you remember. Maybe you've seen it around on social media, but
Yeah.
I'm actually wondering, like, and I was also thinking of how last year's finance bill, like, I guess I don't even know, maybe most people who are protesting didn't even know what it was about. So it's interesting how that this year's finance bill is like even babies in the crib know what it's about, which is actually interesting. And so like I'm wondering, so like two questions. I'm wondering like whether since you said that it's been an accumulating problem, like and so like it's not just this particular regime that has led to the opulence and all that. Like it seems like it's this regime that is having to account for the extravagance. And so like I don't know, like do you feel like either people might have gone too far by not taking into consideration the context that you've given? They're only thinking of the current regime, and also now that people have the finance bill has been rejected, like there are those who are saying we are in for some sort of trouble of some sort. Although, like I think we've had a different explanation earlier, and maybe Dr. RUGO, if you could speak about that, like the fact that there's a whole context to this. It's not just the current regime that all of a sudden went wild. like it's been a problem that has been getting worse by the moment. And so like, should the Kenyan population take that into consideration as they respond? And also like, what do we expect to happen now that the finance bill was rejected?
Thank you very much. I hope I can convince all of us this evening to know that the finance bill is just a tip of the iceberg, and that the issues we are dealing with are critical. If you allowed me to share, hoping that people, because I would like to share 1 or 2 slides that would explain to all of us just what we have been dealing, and you'll see for yourself. But as that comes, so thank you. Tell me if you can see that presentation.
Yes, I can.
Good. So those are deficit numbers. What I mean by deficit numbers, this is how we have been every year. That is how much we have been borrowing. So in 2014, 2015, you have 367 billion. You notice the figures are just going up. 2021, 2022, 976, 846, 720. And this year, 2024, 2025, which is the financial year we have just started, if nothing was to be addressed, we were going to be at 1 trillion. So if you include the finance bill. So this is accumulated, if you count those figures, and all of them are above 500 billion, this is in billion of shillings. So 500 times, those 9 years already brings you to about 4.5 trillion, which is more than the budget of the current financial year. And therefore, what has happened is that over the period, we have been increasing the in-between gap. Remember the gap I said that nobody's talking about? The difference between our revenues and our expenditures has been increasing year on year. But secondly, we have not necessarily been getting the proximate, the correct quantity of public goods and services for the kind of spending that I am showing you there. So what has happened is that you're spending more and more, you're gaining more and more and more in terms of revenue. But let me revert back a bit. It's also important to appreciate that actually there is no year in this country that we have not made more money in terms of revenue. Our revenues have been growing year on year. Basically, it's like me saying, when I met you 5 years ago, you were earning 3,000 shillings, but now you are earning 6,000 shillings, which means your revenue has doubled. But at that point, when you were earning 3,000 shillings, your spending was 2,500, and now you are earning 6,000, but your spending is 10,000 shillings. So what has happened is that expenditure has grown so fast compared to revenue growth. And the reason why expenditure what explains that expenditure has grown so fast compared to revenue is those numbers I have just shown you, where every year you are not necessarily, your revenues are growing, imagine by about 10% per year, but your expenditures are growing at about 15-20% per year. And the gap in between is what you're borrowing. So what has happened now is that you have a very, very bad concoction of, you can barely show, and you've seen the reports of the Auditor General in the last couple of weeks, saying we cannot account for the money that we borrowed. Okay, we cannot account for some of the money that we borrowed, not all of it. But we are paying. This year alone, if I gave you the example of this year alone, this year alone, we are supposed to pay 1.85 trillion. In other words, out of the 2.99 or about 3 trillion that we are expected to collect in ordinary revenue, including what was in the finance bill, which if you remove now, we are down to about 2.6. 1.8 was to go to debt. Of course, we roll over some of the debt. And therefore, we are left with about 1.08 or thereabout trillion to pay in interest payments. So if you are going to pay, so you pay so much money in revenues, in debt financing, remember, you still cannot show. A good example, you build the SGR or the Nyahururu Moyale Road with debt, but you do not recover the money from SGR. So what do? You go back to your coffers because the loan has to be paid. You take a Eurobond of $2 billion in 2014, but you don't invest it in something productive. So come 2024, you go back to the market, you take another Eurobond and pay off. So the Eurobond that you borrowed at 6%, you pay it off at 10%. You borrow money at 10% to pay it off. I mean, ni hesabu zingine ambazo hazieleweki. So that's what lands us where we are. And the only way to survive then, how is it, is what? And that's where now the finance bill discussion, because I wanted to locate where the finance bill comes in. So because you're spending so much money in debt repayment, you still have to provide public services because the population is also increasing and is growing, but you did not make the proper investments of the money that you borrowed, then you have now to find more money. Literally, it's you taking another third job to pay off a loan for a shop you are to set up, but you never set up. And now you have to work until midnight to be able. And that's why they push to increase taxes again and again, which I think is what Kenyans were saying. Hey, wait a minute. We cannot just be saying this is a revenue issue. What about your expenditure? But then on the other hand, as Eric was saying, you are also not taking seriously the kind of expenditures you're having. You've seen the kind of things, if you just take one of the president's speech, one of the latest president's speech, and analyze just the lines, even without amounts of the things that he said will be removed from the budget. They are interesting, very, very interesting. Office of the First Lady, Office of the Second Lady, confidential spending, institutions that are completely insolvent, don't perform anything, 47 of them that need to be dissolved, basically need to be just closed off. Those are the things that we are talking about. That the finance bill then ceases to be the only thing, but the question around proper, prudent use of public resources. Because as I have demonstrated, and I'm happy even to go to some charts which I have, time allowing, revenue is not a problem. We don't have a revenue problem. We never had one. The issue is how expenditures are growing. And some of those expenditures, the OAG is basically telling us, the Office of the Auditor General is telling us, we actually cannot establish whether there was value for money or how this money was spent. I mean, just the last 3 weeks, I think there has been scandal after scandal. NHIF, there's a scandal. What has a scandal? Fertilizer is an issue. And those are all accumulated, is the kind of resources that if you dealt with corruption, you would actually make more money, perhaps twice what the finance bill was going to give you in the current financial year. Which then means that we actually can operate at a third, at 70% of our current projected budget and still deliver all the services. That's exactly what it means. So I hope that locates, so that then our anger, first of all, and the reason why I said I hope I can convince us, is to say that as we move forward, we need to focus our energies properly on this expenditure question, on this deficit financing, and exactly what is this deficit that we are pursuing? What does it finance? And I think for me, that's the anger. That's the anger that I feel. That's a pain that I feel, because I have been looking at these numbers for many, many years, as you have noticed. I've spent at least the last 17, 18 years looking at the numbers only, in different formats. And I can tell you for sure, if you dealt with corruption, if you dealt with leakages, if you dealt with, which is basically just theft of public resources, you will make far much more resources you will achieve much more. You basically will be achieving with 1 shilling what we currently are achieving perhaps with 2 or 3 shillings. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And even as I was just thinking of what you said about how the revenue, like we don't have a revenue problem, because many might possibly think that we actually do have a revenue problem. And so it's interesting that we don't have a revenue problem, that the issue is the expenditure. And I was just, I guess in my mind, I'm thinking maybe, Eric, if you could, I guess, tell us more about, because we've seen that if we don't have a revenue problem and we can like fix our expenditure, we can be able to deal with the debt. And so like, I know Dr. Rugo has already explained what the debt situation is, but maybe if you could be able to expound more on what the debt situation, like, are things as bad? Because like there will be pushback maybe from the current administration that we have to go from country to country to be able to, get donations back into the country because the debt situation is so dire. And then we needed to get a task force to look into the debt situation. And there are people even in the Law Society of Kenya who came in, and so much was going on, and nobody knew what the debt is about. So I don't know how you would maybe comment on someone who says that, oh, we need maybe a debt task force to really confirm what's really going on. Like it's he says, she says. So how would you respond to those who say that this debt thing, we probably need to go outside to get more money, and so like we need to spend money to go outside? How would you maybe respond to them?
Thanks, Charles, for that question. Incidentally, one of the people appointed by the president to be in that task force is on this call, Dr. Rugo. But I think to answer your question, are things that bad? I think the truth of the matter is that things are bad, and it's not been accidental, like Dr. Rugo mentioned. Our deficit has been rising over time. We have had a number of drivers that have led us here. One of them is, of course, consistent deficits, and deficits basically mean it's just fiscal indiscipline. It's like you earning 10,000, but your expenses are 20,000. So, and if you unpack your expenses, you realize that in there you have things that are not necessities, they're actually luxuries, things that you do not need. And that's been our country for the last 10 years plus, where we've been spending, and not just spending a lot, but spending on things that are not important. And I'll give an example. One of the economic models that we've had a lot, and I think it's been misused really, is a Keynesian model of economic growth, where it argues that if you have to borrow money and put it in sectors that have multiplier effects and they have a ripple effect in the economy. One of those is infrastructure, which is capital intensive. Anything that's capital intensive within the government, put your money there, it's going to spur the economy and improve collection as well as growth economically. But what we've done is that we've used some of these models and then tweaked them to fit private interests as opposed to public interest. And what do I mean by that? So we have infrastructure projects like the SGR, whose initial value, I believe, was in the ranges of 157 billion initial cost in the coalition government, I think before Jubilee took over. And the argument then was that the SGR, though important to the country, was not feasible because it needed the country to borrow heavily to finance it. And so what happened is that it was shelved until our revenues can be able to effectively finance. But come 2013 and Jubilee takes over and the project cost is reevaluated upwards, I think, to about 357 billion. The cost the distance is even reduced. And so, of course, there are a lot of feasibility studies, a number of feasibility studies that were done at that time that showed that at the new cost that the SGR was going to be built at, it was not going to be economically sound, that we would not make a profit out of it. It would not have any cost benefit analysis. And I think these are things that Dr. RUGO is mentioned, that we spent a lot of money beyond what we ought to have spent in the name of development financing and high infrastructure development. It was actually infrastructure-led development, and spent a lot of money on things and projects that did not have a cost-benefit analysis. And now I think we've entered is it the 7th year or perhaps 8th year of declaring losses within the SGR, and that is just one of the many. It just happens to be the single largest debt debt item in our debt stock. That's why it's prominent. But a lot of the issues that we've had is around raising debt, and then mismanaging it, or taking it into what the former Auditor General Edward Ouko called highway robbery, and is budgeted corruption. Really, I think the name highway robbery was borrowed from his remarks made in 2019 or 2018 thereabouts, where he argued that the way our budgeting is done as a country is almost like a highway, and these major infrastructural projects become the tracts and the avenues through which money leaves our public coffers. And that's what we've seen in the last couple of years. So we spent on things we never needed to spend, but also at the same time, we have been losing money that we shouldn't be losing as a country. And I'll give an example. I think there's a report that came out towards the end of last year by the National Treasury, which is the tax expenditures report, that showed that Kenya last year alone lost about 393 billion from tax incentives. So tax incentives are incentives that are given to businesses for them to either set camp here or to attract either foreign direct investment or just private investment in key sectors. And so when you think about how much money the country, because tax expenditures, really the idea is that the government provides incentives, but it's supposed to make more money from the incentive that it is giving the businesses, because the businesses are going to provide tax revenue through corporate tax and other forms of tax. But the question is, are we getting commensurate amount of money that we, based on the opportunity that we are foregoing as a country? So when you think about 393 billion and ask yourself, what can we equate that to? That amount of money that the country lost in terms of tax expenditures, for instance, last year alone, was more than we were seeking to raise through the finance bill this year, which was seeking to collect 346 billion. And so you have a sense of misplaced priorities. And I think this has been the context upon which we've been operating in. Dr. RUGO mentioned about the oversight reports from the Auditor General. At some point, the Auditor General report showed that Kenya was losing about 30% of our budget is actually lost to corruption. And what 30% means is exactly what RUGO was mentioning. That 30% means that you actually have a budget which is 70% really. If you truly budgeted as you ought to, then you have enough money to get you going. And I think one of the things, and to piggyback on the point that Dr. RUGO mentioned, I think one of the things that we really need to push and advocate that government leads us to in terms of a conversation in this country is a conversation around zero-based budgeting, where which we don't do really. How we do our budgeting processes in this country is we have allocations this year, and the next year we adjust for inflation and decide what the new budgetary allocations are for the various ministries, states and departments and agencies. And so we never really unpack our budgets to the extent that every public entity that is receiving a budgetary allocation should make a good case for why that is important. and why that money should go to them. And as a result, we just end up having big budgets being mentioned, while in real sense, tucked in between those tiers of budgetary allocations are funds that are not either important, and if they're important, they're not a priority. And if and the other alternative is that they're actually meant not for public use, but for private gain. And that explains, one of the things I think that has been on my mind as a Kenyan has been, for the president, did it take the demonstrations and the the awakening that has happened in the citizens, did it take that for him to realize that there are actions that needed to be taken prior? Of course, we have a lot of resources within this. I think part of a huge component of our budget is actually spent by parastatals. A lot of a huge proportion of our pending bills in this country is held by state corporations. So it did not require us to get here for us to take the drastic measures that have been announced, and a lot more that needs to take place. Because part of the conversation that we are not hearing, and I know the president has made a number of concessions, but part of the conversation I'm yet to hear come out strongly is the unpacking of our budget development expenditure, because there are reports that have been done in this country that showed that the things that were done in terms of development financing in the last 10 years by the Jubilee government could still have been done at much less monies that were spent. So where did the balance of these resources go to? When you think about, for instance, various infrastructure projects, I think the case in point here is a poster child of how not to run a government. I think is a SGR. When you think about this and how it was undertaken, there's money that was used that left a consolidated fund to be able to finance the SGR as part of our contribution as a country. And this money, as has been argued, was enough, if not to entirely finance our project, but to a huge extent to finance the SGR contract. And what then does that mean in the context of the money that was borrowed, arguably to be able to finance the SGR project? And I think these are some of the issues that have led us to where we are now. When you ask how bad is it, about 75% of all the revenues that the government is collecting is going towards debt servicing. I think the Dr. has placed a figure at 1.8%. So for every 100 shillings that this government collects, about 75% of it is going towards debt repayments. And a huge proportion of that is in interest. I think the Control of Budget reports have recently flagged that particularly interest rates on domestic debt. I think there's someone who needs to mute. Interest repayments on domestic debt are about 3 times what we are paying in terms of external debts that we've borrowed, which I think is alarming. In this last financial year that ended June, reports have come out that counties did not receive their equitable share. I think about 8%. And now close to 10% of the equitable share due to all 47 counties did not go in as scheduled as a result of the financial crunch that we are seeing. We've seen reductions of social sector spending, and what this means really, to remove the big English, is we have a progressive constitution, but Kenya is one of the most unequal countries in this continent. The divide between the rich and the poor is glaring. And so when you're in a situation where financing to health is being reduced, financing to education is being reduced, what you're inadvertently doing as a country is widening the inequality gap, and making it impossible for those who are in the margins to even get anywhere closer to be able to afford a dignified life. As a result of the situation that we find ourselves in. And I think we're in a bad place as a country, but we're also in a place where we need to have very honest conversations and push government to be able to take the measures that need to be taken, not just for the next 5 years, but for the foreseeable future. That we don't need to go back to where we were as a country. We don't need to become, continue to become the country we have been, which is not fiscally disciplined. We don't take care of the resources that have been entrusted to us. Because that's then what that means is actually an insult to the people who pay their taxes. If you think about how, especially the people who like are informal employment in this country, it's about maybe about now 3 million. And when you look at the tax measures that have been advanced by the government in the last 2 years, for instance, are largely targeting people who are already in the tax bracket. And it's a very lazy way sometimes of collecting tax, because on one end you are foregoing tax revenues through tax expenditures, and then you're trying to collect the balance of what you'd have collected through tax incentives, for instance, and loading it on Kenyans through regressive tax measures, one of them being VAT, which is a very lazy way of collecting taxes. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Wow, that's a lot. And just before I even continue the conversation, for those who are joining us on YouTube live stream, this is Apologetics Kenya, and we are discussing the relationship between the church and politics. And I guess we are looking at the finance bill for today. So you can also like and subscribe on our YouTube page, and Apologetics Kenya is also on Facebook, also on TikTok, also on X. So you can also interact with us there. And we are also looking forward to seeing some comments have come in. We shall look at them in a few. So as we progress, you did mention, about the fact that some concessions have been made by the government, but probably not sufficient enough. And it's unfortunate that it took demonstrations to be able to bring us here, because that's what many of the protesters were talking about. Did it really require the demonstrations for the concessions to be made, or even for the finance bill to be dropped? And then now there's the issue of COVID-19 period. I think we're told we're losing a couple of billions per day. I can't remember what the figure was. And it couldn't be accounted for. And so, I guess this issue of corruption is, I guess, not only a Kenyan issue, but I guess it's a global issue, but it's also peculiarly African. And so I don't know, maybe Dr. RUGO, if you could be able to comment on, is it possible to really deal with this corruption issue? Because, there are those who would say maybe we should go the China route, where if someone is corrupt, they're just assassinated, or I guess capital punishment. And maybe that's why in China there are fewer incidences of corruption. Is it possible or to really deal with this issue, or do we just accept that this is how it's going to be in Kenya and Africa?
Thank you very much. And I've always wondered why Kenyans who would quickly throw away a bottle yogurt packet out of the window in Nairobi, once they take a flight of just about 8 hours in London, they would not do the same, or in Germany, which simply tells you that people can change their behavior. They just need to be in the right environment. You see, China, Germany, US, all these countries have thugs. But there's something that they do. They enforce the rule of law. Everybody faces the rule of law. And you've seen cases of very high-ranking people in some of these countries go to court even. Some get jailed because of the rule of law. I think it is possible if you implemented the rule of law. Because you see, the rule of law, basically, it's the same thing. It's not very, it's not very popular, but it's the same thing that says, foolishness, resides in children, and a cane, a cane basically of discipline pushes it out. It's the same thing. I don't think those countries are the way they are because they have good people, but it's because everybody faces the law with the same measure. And that makes it messy. for people who want to misbehave, because they know whatever they will do. In fact, some, even if you do it outside the country, you still can get sued in the country because you are a citizen of that country. And therefore, I hold very strongly that we can deal with corruption. We have seen people who have set up institutions and dealt with significant amounts of corruption, and people style up and people line up and people do the right thing. I remember a time when, it was very rampant corruption, in the, even in the armed forces, with how people are getting recruited. And then we had Tonje. You have heard about the Tonje rules. And it streamlined how people get promoted and how people move. And it was no longer about who you know and what you have, but you just know you need to do this, and you get promoted. They're called the Tonje rules. And many other examples that we can cite. Some of them are a bit micro. And even in this country, and even in this government, there are still institutions that run properly, where you go and you get your service. There are offices you still go to and you get a service, and that officer does not expect you. In fact, they will be very shocked, if not troubled, that you're trying to say asante, in monetary terms. So Charles, I believe so strongly that it is possible, but we have to be willing to enforce the rule of law, because without enforcing the rule of law, then it becomes very difficult to do. Everything else becomes cosmetic. So that's my conviction, and I think it is possible.
Yeah, and wow, like I guess it's encouraging because I was thinking of the phrase, I guess in Kiswahili, najihurumia kuwa Mkenya, and in English, I pity myself that I'm a Kenyan, and I think maybe we can move from that phrase to now what you're telling us, that it's possible. I was just also thinking of the fact that if I left Africa, I would start behaving well, and so but now here I'm behaving like I don't have any kinds of moral guidance, and so I guess maybe what I'm thinking, especially for those who feel like, what can they do? Maybe the president can do something. Maybe whoever the leader of the Gen Zs is can do something. Or but now they are feeling like, for them, maybe in their home, or maybe they are just having their small business somewhere and they are not known, but they feel they want to see how they can engage in politics, and so how they can make a difference, because they are feeling like maybe they can do something, but at the same time, there are probably those who are thinking that this institution was ordained by God, so how dare I try to meddle? That's their stuff. Me, I just as a Christian, my job is just to read the Bible and teach people how Jesus died and rose again. So there are those who are, I guess, maybe thinking, I'll just pray about it and hope for the best, because they feel like, it's not the job of a Christian to get involved into politics because it's too dirty. And maybe they can learn a little bit of economics and see what they can do. So maybe, Eric, maybe if you could comment on how the person who feels they're insignificant, they feel like they're not a Dr. RUGO, or they're not an Eric KINAGO, and nobody will even ever know that they exist. So with the information that they're getting today, what can they be able to do in their home or wherever they're at today, and they're listening, and they're probably about to comment maybe, or will be commenting somewhere, how would you advise them to move forward?
I think that's a good question. One, I think, is to implore Kenyans to remember that they are not powerless. And I think maybe I'll start with an example of a man called David Munyakei, and there are many that we could speak about. And David Munyakei, the story, there are many Kenyans who have been brave in this country, and they are tucked in our history, lost in our consciousness as a country. We don't remember them, we rarely talk about them, but they are there. And if we find a bit harder, if we look a bit harder, we will find them. And David Munyakei was a young man, was actually a clerical officer at CBK who blew up the Goldenberg scandal. And there are many others that we could talk about who were just ordinary Kenyans going about their daily work, but unhappy about the things that were happening around them and thought that they could do something about it. Especially during that time, in the old constitutional order that we had, it was unimaginable that you could even do the kind of things that Monyake did and many others of his time. At the heart of a lot of our scandals in this country are devoted and patriotic public servants who are unhappy with what's happening and they actually blow up the whistle. And maybe that explains why for years now we have not been able to enact the whistleblower bill to be able to protect those who speak up about the ills around us. But where do we start? For those who are wondering where to start, I think one of the places to start is start with our history. And it took me reading our history after school to realize that a lot of the history we were taught in school was actually revisionist history. It did not tell us who our true freedom fighters were. It did not tell us who some of our brave Kenyans who attacked in our historical books were. And the more you go back to our history, the more you will discover that if you think that you love this country enough to be able to stand up for truth, for justice, you will not be the first, and neither will you be the last. Those who framed our constitution framed a constitution that, in my view, was forward-looking. Every so often, our constitution surprises us. There are times where people have tried to speak up, and the only bastion that could stop and be the bastion of hope for Kenyans has been the Constitution. And when you think about how our Constitution was framed, the writers of our Constitution, one of the things that gives me hope is that these were people who were just Kenyans like us, but they thought that we could do better as a country, and as a result, they wrote it down. When you think about people who, before independence, stood up against unfair taxation, it's not the first time in this country we are complaining about taxation. We did that under the Kavirondo Association and many others, where the riots that were happening and the uprisings against the hard tax. All these things have been part of our history. The more we go back to our history, the more we will find Kenyans like us who loved this country. Some of them were in the church, because part of what is happening now is that we have Kenyans who feel like the church has lost its place, and maybe that explains why sometimes you've had sentiments like we need to occupy the church and what have you. And it's because we have clergy men and women in this country who have forgotten that we are in the world, but we're not of the world, and so they've been in a competition to try to be like the world, to try and compete with politicians, compete with businesses. When you think about some of the churches in this country, you will enter and you can confuse them with public offices because of the kind of carpets, the thickness of the carpets, and what have you. I think how do we become, the more we go back to our history and find those who love this country, including believers who love this country dearly and stood up for it, the Gitaris, the Okulus, the Ndingis, there are many. Those who enjoy us, those who have in their time spoken up to be able to help us enjoy some of the rights that we do as a country are there. If we look in our history, we're going to find them, and it's going to inspire our journey. And once we do, I think one of the things that also is a charge. I think in a space like this, in the conversation we are having, a lot of what we also not saying a lot is that we also have had breakdown of morals, and I like what Daktari was saying. And when on the roads, you'll see people just mtu anakula miwa, anatupa miwa kwa barabara. Others will throw away cans. And when you think about people who are corrupt in this country, it's not just the president, for example, or people who are close to him. It's a lot of us. It's Ruto works from State House. He doesn't work from immigration. So how do you explain the corruption that we hear about immigration in the issuance of passports? Ruto, we may say all what we could say about the president, but he doesn't work from KRA, and he is not a county askari. And we know the stories we've heard about county askaris in this country and across the counties. So these are our fathers, they're our brothers, they're our mothers. How can we ask ourselves the hard questions? Because as they say, habits are not taught, they are caught. And the breakdown of morals must begin from our homes. Having these conversations about, can we, as we imagine about the kind of president we need to have, can we also imagine about the kind of citizenry we must become? Because the citizenry we must become must be a continuous imagination that takes place across the corners of this country, so that we can be better families, we can be better societies. And the more we do that, those societies are going to contribute better leaders who are more accountable, because someone does not become does not adopt a culture of impunity when they get into leadership. They are a product of who we are as society. And then I think it's important to mention this, that once we look at our history, we need to imagine the country we need to become. Because I think what the Gen Zs, for instance, have helped us to do is that they have showed us the wall, what it looks like, the picture of what it looks like to have an accountable country. But the question is, are we going to go back to what we were before what has happened? Because if we do that, then the joke is on us. But I think the other bit is, once we do that, is to look at our constitution. We have provisions for active citizenship. The framers of our constitution anticipated an active citizenry. An active citizenry, one is you get to know what is happening. I have met people in this country who rejected the finance bill. They had not read it. It's okay, we rejected it. But the finance bill is not the only budget document that is important. This coming month, on the 30th of August, will signal the beginning of the next financial year in terms of budget making process. The budget making process begins on the 30th of August every year, and the culmination of it is when the budget is read or when we hear the finance bill. But in between that, there are so many documents that come out. Part of some of the most important documents is, there are many, of course, they're all important, but I think the budget policy statement. How are we engaging in the budget policy statement? At the county level, are we engaging in the county fiscal strategy paper? These are statutory documents which are always going to exist in this country as long as we have the framework, the institution and policy framework that we have on public finance management. But we can't stop at the finance bill and hope to come again to board this train again next year when the finance bill comes up. It probably may not come up, but there's going to be a budget policy statement. There's going to be a debt strategy paper. Are we engaging in those documents? Are we looking at documents that show how the government is being run every quarter? Because those are the budget implementation review reports that come out from the country control of budget, and there are reports that are for counties and there are reports for the national government. You don't have to wait until the end of a financial year to know what the Auditor General is saying about the running of affairs of the state. You can do that in between a financial year. So I don't think there is a shortcut. We must read our way into being active citizens, but we must also keep, of course, praying for the country, because it's important. We are reminded in is it Timothy about making prayers up for those in authority, so that we are able to enjoy the products of that. Jeremiah 29 again speaks about pray for the country that you are in, because if the country prospers, then you yourself are going to prosper. We need to pray, but we also need to read backwards, imagine forwards, and participate. And participating is not just it's not breaking into parliament, is ensuring that your voice is heard. If you are close to a politician, let them know that their handout is not more important, is not even important. than them being accountable. Because one of the other things that we rarely talk a lot is the cost of politics in this country. And we've heard Tangula say that politicians are like ATMs, which is true. The average member of parliament, it has been reported by I think a report that came out about 2 years ago, that they spend close to between 5 and 600,000 per month just on handouts. Harambe here and something there that requires money, and it is us who are doing that. So if we can pause with our expectations on these leaders in terms of handouts and ask them to focus on the things that we've elected them to do, then I think we're going to begin to see a level of accountability that is a bit greater than we have seen in the past. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Eric. And I just like how you've also shown that everyone is culpable. In fact, I was just thinking of the doctrine of all have sinned. It's not only the president, but even we can be corrupt at times, and we need to see what role we can play. And so it seems like we have like around 10 minutes left. And that's for the Q&A actually now, because we are getting into the Q&A session. So for those who have just joined us, it's Apologetics Kenya. We are continuing our second installment of our series on the church and politics. And so like, I think I'll just get into the Q&A. And I guess maybe Dr. RUGO can answer the first question. So like someone is asking, I guess everybody's angry at the borrowing, but now this person is asking whether borrowing can be done in a good way, whether like it's possible to borrow in an unmitigated manner, and like how the borrowing can be checked, like how we can check, okay, this was enough, this was a little bit more than enough, but we can run with it. And then also there's this question on, I think Jimmy Wanjigi said we are odious. I actually didn't hear that, so I don't know if any of you knows about that, but you can comment on whichever part you might understand, because I personally don't understand that one. So the how we can borrow and whether we are odious, as Jimmy Wanjigi puts it.
Good, thanks. So first of all, I think I think it is possible to have prudent borrowing. And prudent borrowing is basically a factor of two things. One, borrowing in the best terms possible, so in terms of interest rates, which is what has been a big challenge. But investing the money for purposes for which it was borrowed in ways that are in productive sectors. So, I mean, with a country, you don't just play around, where you borrow and just go and spend on anything that you want. You actually want to borrow and invest in industry, invest in income, in job creation, because that's what gives you taxes, so that then you are able to pay off. We have not been doing very well on those two fronts because on the front of interest rates, our local borrowing is at 18%. And when you borrow at 18%, honestly, what can you invest in that can give you the return to even just pay the loan, leave alone even make a profit? The second one has to do with spending money in the rightful purposes, which is a big factor actually of borrowing, because it means then your investments make a return for you, and you are able to achieve something, something different, something else for your society, for your people. So in terms of just that, the question of odious debt, I have been, and Eric did say yes, I have been appointed to this task force that's supposed to look into debt. And one of the things is to establish, did we borrow at the rightful terms? Do we know extent of how much we actually have borrowed, the conditions, how much we are paying? And yesterday I was in a meeting with one of the members of the Committee on Public Debt and Privatization, and he didn't confirm something that I have also heard from the president, that nobody seems to know the exact amount of money we actually owe. That's very interesting, because even the Auditor General has complained of not receiving all the information she's looking for to be able to. So can you imagine a situation where you actually don't know how much you owe? It means that every time somebody comes calling, there was that story by, at least that man knew, there's the story of, must be, is it Okonko or I forget the name, by Chinua Achebe. At least he had drawn on the walls, how much each person owed him. The one who owed him the least, he had drawn a small line on the wall. The one who owed him the most, he had a big line. Of course, the joke of the life is that the guy who owed him so little is the one who used to come and knock for him early in the morning, asking him for his money. The point here is that I think we actually do need, whatever form and shape it takes, we actually do need to know how much do we owe? What are the conditions? How much have we paid? That is not a picture that is clear as from where I sit. And the reason why it's not clear is because we have two types of debts that we are paying. One is public debt. This is debt that is procured directly by the by the Central Bank of Kenya on behalf of the National Treasury and is spent for different projects and financing. But there's another one they call publicly guaranteed debt. This is debt that is taken by parastatals, by the Kenyans, the Kenya Airways, the 248 parastatals, but even now by counties. We don't have a very clear picture of how much those institutions owe. Yesterday, we were told a very interesting story that, in fact, there is some money that had been borrowed for one of the institutions, but the institution was actually not aware that money had been borrowed in their name. And therefore, when the committee wrote to them, they asked, oh, you mean there is actually money that is supposed to be borrowed that was borrowed in our name? So they wrote to the treasury asking, we are being told that there is money that was borrowed in our name, but we have never received that money. So those things like that. And that is where the question of odiousness actually comes in. So because odious debt means this is money that we actually did not borrow, or we actually have finished paying, but we are still paying. But see, because if you don't know how much you owe, how do you know at what point you have either finished paying, but most importantly, what are the terms, what are the conditions? And those are the questions that the Auditor General is asking. That are very helpful for how we resolve this whole matter. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. And just crucial for us to exactly know like what the financial situation is. And we're hoping we can be able at least to get there to at least reduce the anger that is in many of the Kenyans. And I guess maybe what I could also is another question on like how anger can be constructively used, because now there seems just to be these constant protests that don't seem to be heading anywhere. And maybe it's possible that the protesters don't even understand most of the issues you have described here. And so like how can this anger be constructively used? Should it be used getting to understand these issues that we've been discussing? And I guess maybe there are those, and we've touched on this, but there's a question asking on the effects of rejecting the finance bill. I think we touched on it, but maybe it can just be touched on quickly. And then the best way is, I think we said revenue is not a problem, but they're asking the best way to collect revenue. So I guess maybe if Eric, and we seem to have like 5 minutes for the rest of the program today, but maybe if you can maybe make a 1-2 minute response on the revenue issue, the finance bill, now that it's dropped, what's next, and then how we can constructively protest.
Yeah, thanks. I think on how, and I think we, in a sense, in a way, touched on this. How can we finance as a result of the what has happened? I think Dr. RUGO has mentioned that it is possible to do it the right way. We have counties. I think really at the heart of what I would say is the first thing is accountability. a lot of the counties in this country, and this is now a shift from the national government, a lot of the counties in this country are not declaring their true own source revenue. You have a lot of money that is being collected. So on the ground, Kenyans are feeling overtaxed in those counties. But one of the most consistent thread across counties in Kenya is the lack of attainment of revenue projection. So you set a target for yourself, and then you don't meet that target. And it's easy to say that you didn't meet that target because either the business was not doing well, but there's also something to be said about revenue that is collected that is not declared. And we've seen a lot of these issues being flagged by oversight reports. So I think accountability is key. Whatever you're doing, if you do without the intention to be accountable, we will still not get to where we need to get as a country. If it's a Kenya Revenue Authority, the money that is being collected, whether it's in appropriations, in aid, the services that Kenyans are collecting, we are still hearing cases being reported about the thousands of accounts that government entities hold, which are not coordinated in any way. And so you have agencies that either are spending at source or they are maintaining accounts in commercial banks that are not available for scrutiny. That's the accountability we are talking about. Because then what it does is that it opens the opportunity for plundering of resources, which then gets our problem from bad to worse. I think another bit is of course I think tied to the accountability is addressing corruption, but also looking at progressive ways of taxation. There is a progressive way that you can tax, because tax is important. The more, if we can get our tax to the point where we don't need to borrow, I think that's the joy of every citizen, that we are able to sustainably finance our budget without having to borrow. And we have a history in this country where we've actually ran balanced budgets, I think for 2 years in a row. So I think there are progressive tax measures, there are regressive tax measures. What we've seen, especially with government, is the pursuance of regressive tax measures. And what regressive tax measures mean is that you have tax measures or you have a tax measure that you are pushing that is having a higher effect, undue negative effect on those who are most marginalized. So I'll give an example. For instance, this year there was one of the contentious budget proposals was touching on bread. When you think about what that means, if the richest Kenyan buys a loaf of bread and the poorest Kenyan buys the same loaf of bread, the amount of tax they are paid is the same. That's a regressive tax measure, because the purpose of taxation is to redistribute wealth and income, so that you have an equitable kind of society. So I think these are some of the measures that could be taken to ensure that we are able to collect a bit more. I think in terms of channeling of the anger, we did again. I think we did speak about it. It's important to know what the levels of time are. Ensure that your voices are heard, and I think I don't think these protests don't have an end in itself. We have seen a lot of concessions being made in the recent past as a result of the pushback than we have seen in previous years. And I think one of the things that we can also laud this new wave of demonstrations is that they're trying to not just tell the government but also the opposition that you need to get your act together, because the truth of the matter is that the principal interest of politicians is to get elected or get re-elected. Oftentimes, you will not have politicians sitting down to think about, as we have seen, especially in our history in this country, to think about the issues that are important for Wanjiku, and that's why people are in the streets. And yet, the reason why they exist is to be able to have those discussions. We've also seen instances, including in this country and beyond, where leaders can sit and actually discuss issues that affect the people who have elected them. And I think my sense is, how do we channel the anger towards constantly reminding leaders that this is what we've elected them to do, and they need to pay fidelity to the issue that we've elected them to do. And of course, to continue to engage, not to engage as a one-off ad hoc process, but to take a commitment to engage for the long haul. We didn't mention that budget making in this country is a process. It's not an event. It begins in August. It ends next year when we hear the budget being read or a finance bill again. But there will be moments in our calendar this year where Kenyans will be required to give their input. And when that opportunity opens, they need to ensure that their voice is heard. And how their voice will get heard is if they are taking time to read on what's happening. And if you struggle with reading, that's where our churches can come in, our spaces can come in, create spaces where, like this, if someone may not be able to go through, maybe out of 10 people, probably 8 may not be able to go through the finance bill. But when you have conversations like this that ventilate the issues in a way that people have an informed way of engaging, I think this is what we do. We need to do a lot more in our churches, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our Bible study. I'm one of those people who has been part of these conversations, even in our Bible study fellowships every week when we meet, so that we carry everyone with us, so that we don't have people who understand what is happening, and in the same group you have Kenyans who do not know what is happening and therefore cannot engage optimally. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Just thinking about discussing the finance bill in a Bible study. I think it's very interesting. And in fact, in the previous session last week, the host was talking about how there's no sphere in the world of which God does not say, "This is mine." And it's a quote from a guy called Abraham Kuyper, which is, I think it's interesting, even how you've put it. And I guess like you even touched on another question. The next question was about how the youth can exercise their sovereign power apart from the demonstrations. Because like I'm looking at, for example, today, and I guess I'm preempting next week's discussion is about how we engage the crisis. And we've already even spoken a lot about it. Because like, for example, today there weren't any demonstrations. I don't know if it's because it was cold or because maybe people are getting tired, whatever the case may be. And I think some of these issues are important just to look into. And there was also a question about what Kenyans need to know about the public finance management that is not obvious to the common mwananchi. Maybe the mama mboga or the boda boda might probably need to see like what do they need to know and things of that nature. So maybe that could be the last comment before now we finish, because we've already run out of time. So maybe Dr. RUGO, maybe if you can just maybe see how we can tie everything together before we close off for today on just the way forward in terms of even that economic, civic, economic education, because like there are some of the things you've said that have gone past my head and I need to go back to the video and just listen to it again. So like maybe as a parting shot, how can we say we'll be moving forward in terms of like even learning all this? And you said that there's some things we need to look forward to, like 30th August and things of that nature. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would suggest that first of all, we must not underrate even the ability to engage the way we are engaging. I think one of the things that I have heard is people feeling like if I didn't go to the streets, if I don't do the analysis that some of these guys do, perhaps I'm doing nothing. I think not doing anything is what should be shunned. But even just raising a question, putting a post, expressing your anger, expressing your pain, I think needs to be celebrated. So I think we need to learn to celebrate our efforts, because it's a collective of those small efforts that makes the big. Not this big bravado kind of, show stopping, traffic stopping kind of activities. Those ones, very few of us get that chance. Some of us have been more privileged to sit in very high level conversations, but not everybody will ever get that chance. So let us not, minimize the value of every space that we are. But having said that, I think as Paul will tell Timothy, let us make the most of every opportunity, because indeed the days are evil. And this one is in the literal sense. So let us make every opportunity to raise questions. One of the reasons why we have established for ourselves a representative system is so that questions can be asked. The floor of the house exists to answer questions. That's how parliaments are designed across the world. Questions. So sometimes you don't need to have a solution. I've had people say, no, if you're coming, come with solutions. No, you actually just need to have questions. There are people who we pay very highly to think about the solutions. So let's ask questions. Let's make the most of every opportunity. But thirdly, let us be the change and the transformation that we want to see in society. I see many people who hate tribalism, but when they have the least chance, they use it to whenever they have a chance to maximize out of it, whenever they have a chance to employ somebody, they employ their own tribe. I see people who say they hate corruption, but as long as it is benefiting them, they look the other side. I see people who say they hate mediocrity, but then the kind of work they do when they are given a chance, and as an employer, I can tell you there are times when I have given work to people in different spaces, or trusted somebody to do an assignment, and then they have done work that both of us cannot associate with either of us. So be the change, be the transformation that you want to see. Because imagine if everybody decided I will never bribe a cop, how this country will transform. If everybody decided when I go to Nyayo House and I need my passport, I will not try to make a call to who I know. That when I apply for a job, I will wait to get feedback. I will not call and try to undercut others or try to get unfavorable advantage. We will change this country. We will change this place. So for me, those are the things that I think are critical for our action. Not looking down on the opportunities that we have, making the most of those opportunities, but being the change that we want to see. But having said all that, zeal or ambition without knowledge is dangerous. I think it's somewhere in, must be Proverbs 13 or thereabout. I was reading it today. Therefore, we need to train ourselves. Part of going to school is to be able to read. These forums are many. In YouTube right now, if you go and type, anything, budget process, you type my name, there are many recordings that I have done that will give you a lot of information. When we put out forums, I work in an organization, Budgeti Hub, that basically exists to, to collaborate with Kenyans from all walks to help them engage and to transform our society. So when you see forums are being advertised, join in with a notebook and a pen and write and learn, because you learn in 1 hour. Like what we have done here is purely a masterclass. What you have discussed here in 1.5 hours, you might never find it in a school anywhere. This is experience. This is ground, touching of things. So thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. We look forward to more engagements. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot. And also want to thank everyone else who's joining the live stream. And I just wanted to, before we leave, I wanted to share at least our social media. So for those who, so this was the post that we had out. This was on our X page, Apologetics Kenya. And so you can, after this live stream, it will be archived for future reference. And then also the actual YouTube page is Apologetics Kenya. And so that's the page. You can like and subscribe and share. So this was the church and the political crisis interpreting was the first session. And what we have now is the second session on just trying to come to grips with what is going on. And so we will end the live stream now. And next week, we want to engage with the crisis. And I guess it's like we've already engaged, but we will engage with it a bit more. And so we look forward to seeing you again on Apologetics Kenya, Thursday, 8 p.m. This is East African time, for those not in Kenya. And yes, so that will be, I think that's the 25th of July. We will do this again. And yes, we look forward to more. So yeah, so let me just say a word of prayer before I end the live stream. God, we thank you for the discussion that we've been able to have, and we pray that you would continue guiding the nation. There are many who are grieving the loss of lives, also other issues ongoing. We don't know how to understand, and a lot of anxiety on what really will happen later on. And we pray that that God, you would be able to guide us to be able to trust you, that you are always in control. You're in the heavens doing whatever you please, and also continue guiding us to see how we can put works to our faith and see how we can be part of the solution. It's not our will, but yours be done in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So just a second.
Amen.